One warm spring day an old woman was sitting at home picking lice while a sparrow hopped about in her garden. Then a little boy threw a stone at the sparrow and broke its leg. As the sparrow fluttered helplessly along the ground, a crow came circling overhead. "The poor thing," thought the old woman. "The crow will get it." She picked the sparrow up, breathed on it, fed it, and put it in a little tub to keep it safe for the night. In the morning she fed the sparrow rice mixed with powdered copper to make it better. Her children and grandchildren made fun of her. "Silly old thing," they said, "now you're babying sparrows." She tended the sparrow for a month or two till it could hop again, and the sparrow was as happy as could be. If she went out she made someone watch it and feed it for her. The family kept teasing her unkindly. "What's all this fuss over a sparrow?" they grumbled. "It's such a dear little thing, you see," she answered. At last the sparrow seemed mended. "The crows will never get you now," she said, taking it outside and lifting it on her open palm. "Let's see how you fly." The sparrow wobbled into the air and flew away. Having spent so long fussing over the sparrow, feeding it every day, and putting it to bed, she missed it very much. Sometimes she talked about it, and even wondered aloud whether it might come back. Mocking laughter was all she got in return. 3 weeks or so later, she heard a sparrow chirping loudly nearby. Sure enough, it was her sparrow, back again. "How lovely!" she cried. "You haven't forgotten me." The sparrow cocked an eye at her, dropped something tiny from its beak, and flew off. It was a single gourd seed. She kept it because the sparrow had brought it to her. Her children jeered at her for being so happy about a present from a silly sparrow, but she had it to plant it, the seed, and see how it would grow. By fall, the vine was huge and laden with far more fruit than any ordinary gourd vine. The old woman was very pleased. Though she gave gourds away to all the neighbors, there were always plenty more. The family who had mocked her now ate gourd for every meal. Finally, she shared the gourds with the whole village, then hung 7 or 8 of the very biggest up inside to dry. Months later, when the gourds were ready, she began taking them down. How heavy they were! She cut the top off of one to make a storage container, and on finding the gourd was full, she poured out what seemed like a whole gourdful into a bucket. And the gourd was still as full as before. It was the sparrow who had to thank for this miracle. She was in rapture. The other gourds were just as full, and no matter how much she poured out, there was always more left, and she knew what to do with. Her family then grew rich. The neighbors could not believe their eyes, and were terribly jealous. "What makes you and her so different?" they complained to their old woman. "She's made them rich. We don't see you doing that for us." The woman went to her successful neighbor to find out how she had done it. "I gather it had something to do with the sparrow," she said, "but I don't quite understand. Please tell me the whole story." The first old woman admitted cautiously that it had all started with a seed a sparrow had brought her, and when pressed for details, she thought it would be petty of her not to tell all. She explained how she had cared for the sparrow with the broken leg, and how she had planted the grateful sparrow's seed. The neighbor begged for just one seed from the bountiful vine, but the first old woman said no, she really could not give out the seeds. She offered rice, though, from her gourds instead. The disappointed neighbor decided she would find her own injured sparrow, and kept a sharp eye out for one, but in vain. Then she noticed the sparrows hopping about at her back door each morning, feeding on the rice grains scattered there. She tried throwing stones at them. There were so many sparrows, and she threw so many stones, that she finally managed to stun one. In glee, she broke its leg properly, then fed it food and medicine. As far as she could see, if one would make her rich, then more would make her richer, and she would get all more praise from her children than the neighbor woman had gotten from hers. So she scattered more rice and threw more stones at the sparrows she had hit. Afterward she hit 3. That seemed like enough, and she put them in a tub and looked after them for a few months till they were better, then merrily took them outside and watched them flutter away. She was ever so pleased with herself. The sparrows, on the other hand, were very unhappy to have had their legs broken, and to have then been shut up for months. In 10 days the 3 sparrows came back, and the woman peered eagerly at their beaks. Each dropped a gourd seed, then flew off. "There!" she chortled, and planted the seeds. The vines grew faster than normal, and became very large, but they did not bear very many gourds. 7 or 8 per vine, no more. The woman looked on with a big grin. "You told me I was useless," she said to her children, "but I'm doing better than the woman next door." How the children hoped she was right. Since there were so few gourds, they gave none away, and did not even eat any themselves. But then they remembered that the neighbor woman had shared her gourds with the whole village, and had given them some as well. Perhaps they should offer some to other people, since they had 3 vines. The old woman agreed to give their nearest neighbors some gourds, and even sat down to a meal of gourd with her family. Everyone took a liberal portion, but the gourd turned out to be horribly bitter, and whoever ate any threw up. The neighbors they had been so generous to besieged the house, shouting, "What kind of stuff was that you gave us? Everyone who's even touched it is nearly dead from nausea and vomiting." But the old woman and her children, writhing on the floor and retching helplessly, were in no condition to answer. Fortunately, the victims recovered in a few days. What a disaster! The old woman decided she had been over-eager and ought to have waited longer for the gourds to turn into rice, so she hung up the rest to dry. Months later, when she judged they were done, she got together enough containers to hold her harvest. Her toothless old mouth gaped wide in a shameless grin as she took down the gourds. Then she poured. Out came houseflies, wasps, centipedes, lizards, and snakes, which battered onto her eyes, her ears, and every part of her body, and stung her without pity. But she was so sure she was pouring out rice that she never felt a thing. She just kept muttering, "Just you wait, you little sparrows. I'll get some from each of you." Swarms of venomous snakes from the gourds bit the children, and stung the old woman herself to death. Those 3 sparrows had enlisted the help of every nasty creepy-crawly in the world, and put them in the gourds. Envy is something to avoid.